You know what's funnier than Nigel Farage spending decades railing against politicians who break the rules? Nigel Farage potentially being investigated for breaking the rules himself. The man who's made an entire career out of positioning himself as the anti-establishment outsider, the truth teller who calls out corruption and hypocrisy wherever he finds it, is now facing a police probe over claims his campaign spent too much money during last year's general election. And the cherry on top? The allegations come from someone inside his own party. You genuinely couldn't write this stuff. Well, you could, but people would complain it was too on the nose. Yet here we are, watching the king of Brexit and champion of political reform potentially getting caught out by the very electoral laws he'd probably claim need reforming. Grab your popcorn, because this is going to be absolutely delicious. So let's set the scene. Last July, after approximately 8,000 failed attempts, Nigel Farage finally won a seat in Parliament. He became the MP for Clacton, which frankly had been looking increasingly likely given he'd been hovering around that constituency like a political ghost for years. It was meant to be his triumphant moment, his vindication, proof that persistence pays off and that the British public finally wanted him in Westminster rather than just on their television screens complaining about Brussels. Victory at last. Cue the champagne and the self-congratulatory interviews about how he'd overcome the establishment machine. But now, several months later, that victory is being questioned. Not by political opponents engaging in sour grapes, though there's probably some of that as well. No, this is coming from inside the House. Richard Everett, a former Reform UK councillor who was actually part of Farage's campaign team, has gone to the Metropolitan Police with documents claiming the campaign broke electoral spending rules. This isn't some random activist with a grudge. This is someone who was there, who presumably saw the receipts, who knows where the bodies are buried, or in this case, where the undeclared leaflets and banners are hidden. The allegations are pretty straightforward. There's a legal spending limit for constituency campaigns, and in Clacton, that limit was £20,660. Reform's official returns claim they came in just £400 under that limit, which is cutting it remarkably fine. It's like doing your taxes and claiming you owe exactly nothing. Technically possible, but eyebrow-raising enough to make anyone with a functioning brain cell think there might be some creative accounting going on. According to Everett, when you add in all the other spending on items like leaflets, banners, and utility bills that weren't declared, the campaign actually went over the cap. Not by a little bit either, but significantly enough that someone felt compelled to take it to the police. Now, Reform's response to these allegations has been entirely predictable. They'd gone straight for the messenger rather than addressing the message. Everett is a disgruntled former councillor who was expelled from the party several months ago. The implication being that he's making this all up out of spite, that he's a bitter ex-member with an axe to grind who's decided to cause trouble because he's got nothing better to do with his time. It's the political equivalent of saying your ex is crazy and that's why the relationship didn't work out. Maybe true, maybe convenient, definitely suspicious when you refuse to address the actual substance of the accusations. But here's where it gets interesting. Everett didn't just go to the press with vague allegations. He went to the Metropolitan Police with actual documents. That suggests he's got evidence beyond just his word against theirs. You don't walk into a police station making serious allegations about electoral law violations unless you've got something reasonably solid to back it up, because otherwise you're just wasting everyone's time and potentially opening yourself up to legal consequences. The Met then referred it to Essex Police, who've confirmed they're assessing a report relating to alleged misreported expenditure. That's police speak for, we're looking into this and taking it seriously. The Electoral Commission presumably will get involved as well, because this is exactly the sort of thing they exist to investigate. Election spending rules aren't just bureaucratic nonsense dreamed up to annoy candidates. They exist to ensure some level of fairness in the electoral process. The idea is that you can't just buy an election by outspending your opponents 10-1. There has to be some limit on how much money you can throw at a campaign. Otherwise, politics just becomes a game of who's got the deepest pockets, and democracy dies a slow death by checkbook. What makes this situation particularly juicy is the sheer irony of it all. Farage has spent his entire political career positioning himself as the outsider fighting against a corrupt establishment that plays by one set of rules while imposing another set on everyone else. He's the man of the people, the truth teller, the one politician you can trust because he's not part of the Westminster bubble. He's made an art form out of calling out other politicians for their hypocrisy and rule breaking. And now, here he is, potentially caught in exactly the kind of scandal he'd normally be gleefully exploiting if it involved anyone else. The political reactions have been predictably partisan, but also quite revealing. Labour's chair Anna Turley has gone straight for the jugular, demanding that Farage answer serious questions about whether he broke the law and misled the public. She's talking about how parliamentary democracy relies on people playing by the rules, how all candidates need a fair hearing, how Farage needs to come clean and put all evidence on the table. It's all very high-minded and principled, which is easy to be when you're not the one under investigation. But she's also not wrong. If these allegations are true, it's a serious breach of electoral law. Even more interesting is the Conservative response. Kevin Hollinrake, the Tory chair, has also called for a full investigation. Now, you might think the Conservatives would be quietly pleased to see their main rival on the right getting investigated and potentially damaged. But Hollinrake is taking the high road, talking about obligations to play by the rules and ensure elections are free and fair. Whether this is genuine principle or strategic positioning is anyone's guess. Perhaps it's both. Perhaps the Tories see an opportunity to wound reform while looking statesmanlike. Perhaps they're genuinely concerned about electoral integrity. Perhaps pigs are currently doing loop-de-loops over Westminster. What's fascinating about spending scandals is how they reveal the unglamorous reality of political campaigns. We like to think of elections as these grand democratic exercises where ideas clash and the best arguments win. In reality, they're logistical nightmares involving thousands of leaflets, dozens of banners, rental costs for campaign offices, utility bills, transportation, staff, volunteers, and an endless parade of expenses that all need to be tracked and reported. It's less West Wing and more accounts receivable. And somewhere in that chaos of receipts and invoices, it's entirely possible for things to slip through the cracks, or for calculations to be, shall we say, optimistic. The question is whether this was an honest mistake or deliberate rule-breaking. Did Reform genuinely not realize they were over the limit, or did they know full well and decide to risk it and worry about the consequences later? These are the questions that an investigation would need to answer, and they're not easy ones to resolve. Electoral spending rules are complex. There are arguments about what counts as campaign spending and what doesn't. There are arguments about allocation of costs when you've got regional and national campaigns running simultaneously. But Reform's defense that these are inaccurate claims from a disgruntled ex-member doesn't really cut it. If the claims are inaccurate, prove it. Open the books. Show everyone exactly what was spent and on what. Demonstrate that everything was properly declared and that the total came in under the limit. The fact that they're going with these allegations are false and also the person making them is bitter suggests they might not be entirely confident in their position. There's also the small matter of timing. Everett was expelled from Reform several months ago, but he was part of the campaign team during the election. So presumably he saw how things were being run, he saw what was being spent, he saw what was being declared. And at some point, something made him uncomfortable enough that after being expelled, he decided to take what he knew to the police. That's a pretty serious step. You don't do that lightly. It suggests either genuine concern about rule breaking or spectacular levels of bitterness, possibly both. The broader context here is that Reform has been positioning themselves as the party of change, the alternative to business-as-usual Westminster. They're supposed to be different, better, more honest, less corrupted by the system. That's their entire brand. It's what attracts their supporters. The idea that while other parties are playing games and breaking rules, Reform is shooting straight and telling the truth. If these allegations stick, that brand takes a massive hit. You can't credibly claim to be the outsider reforming the system if you're breaking the system's rules to win elections. This also puts pressure on Farage personally in a way that might be more damaging than people realize. His entire political persona is built on being the guy who calls out everyone else's BS. He's the truth teller, the straight shooter, the one who's not afraid to say what everyone else is thinking. That persona requires a certain moral authority. You can only effectively criticize others if you're not vulnerable to the same criticisms yourself. If Farage gets seriously damaged by this scandal, his ability to do what he does best, pointing at other politicians and shouting about how terrible they are, gets significantly weakened. There's something almost Shakespearean about watching Farage, who spent years calling for investigations into everyone from EU officials to mainstream British politicians, now facing an investigation himself. It's the classic tale of the crusader who becomes what they fought against, or at least becomes vulnerable to the same accusations they threw at others. The man who demanded transparency and accountability is now being asked to provide exactly that and seems distinctly uncomfortable about it. Of course, we should be careful about rushing to judgment. These are still allegations. The investigation hasn't concluded. Reform denies any wrongdoing. Farage hasn't been charged with anything. There is a possibility, however remote it might seem, that this all gets cleared up and Reform is vindicated. Maybe Everett got his numbers wrong. Maybe there's a perfectly innocent explanation for everything. Maybe the investigation will conclude that all rules were followed and nothing untoward happened. It's possible. Pigs might also develop flight capability, but it's technically possible. What we're really watching here is a test of whether Reform can live up to its own rhetoric. They've positioned themselves as the party that's going to clean up politics, that's going to hold people accountable, that's going to operate differently than everyone else. That's their entire brand. It's what attracts their supporters. The idea that while other parties are playing games and breaking rules, Reform is shooting straight and telling the truth. If these allegations stick, that brand takes a massive hit. You can't credibly claim to be the outsider reforming the system if you're breaking the system's rules to win elections. This also puts pressure on Farage personally in a way